So today, after the Fed's comments, and you can watch my video on what I think the Fed actually said, I believe there's kind of a whiff of panic in the Fed. I think they're worried, and they're a lot worried. The inflation rate is still way too high. And as we saw in the previous video, it's kind of hard to say that, like they did say, that the reason that they think a September cut's coming is because of unemployment. I just don't find that realistic, okay? So how does the market correction, crash, or whatever come about? Well, normally it attacks the short end, okay? And when I say that, the short end of the bond market, that's where liquidity first gets attacked. Because when you think about it, if you're doing a repo, or if you're doing, a 30-day roll, commercial paper, anything like that, if liquidity goes away, then those rolls, the short-term paper, they're the first things that go, okay? So why don't we go back to the great financial crisis and see what we can see to see, is there anything there that is reflective of today? So first, let's look at the Fed fund rates from the St. Louis Fed, which belongs to the Fed. And if you go back to August of 2007, okay, when we started the great financial crisis, believe it or not, the federal fund rate was 5.31%. Today, it's 5.33%. Now our 10-year bond today, as you can see, is 3.79%. And believe it or not, in August of 2007, it was 3.8%, literally exactly the same. So the bond market and our short end basically look exactly like the market in August of 2007 as we started into the great financial crisis. So the first question we have to ask ourselves is, okay, somehow, some way, the liquidity leaves the market. And that liquidity then attacks the short end of the market, which then rolls everything over, okay? So is there anything that happened in 2007 that could have taken away the liquidity in the market? Well, here's crude oil for the last, 30 years. And if you look there, in July of 2007, we had the great oil crisis. We basically went from, $30 a barrel to $150 a barrel. This transfer of wealth is massive. What is the largest trade in the world every single day? Every day. It's the oil trade, okay? So with all the millions of barrels every day, like I think it's 18 million or 22 million barrels a day that we use, you multiply that times another $100 per day, and we were transferring the wealth of the Western world into the OPEC. But the effects on the financial system was that the liquidity was sucked out of our financial system, okay? So, and by the way, if you go back to the panic of 1907, okay, all our currency in those days were gold-based. In other words, they're dollars backed by gold. And 2 months before the panic of 1907, we had the San Francisco city fire, which destroyed San Francisco. And it also burned down the San Francisco Federal Reserve. The only thing that remained was the safe. And the safe was red hot. Okay, so they knew that if they opened the safe, that it would immediately incinerate all the gold dollar bills in the San Francisco Fed. So what did they do? They left it there. And if you go back and read, you'll see this was a major issue, that we didn't have enough gold, we couldn't print any more dollars, the liquidity was sucked out, and we had the great financial panic of 1907. So 2 liquidity events, totally different. Again, It doesn't matter what the liquidity event is. It matters that it happens before we go into a lot of trouble. So once the liquidity is yanked out of the market, okay, then the short paper goes belly up. And lo and behold, the first and largest money market fund in history, the reserve fund, broke the buck. And even though it was because of Lehman, and again, we'll get that in a minute, but because of the reserve fund breaking the dollar, even though Lehman was only a small percent, everyone pulled their money out of the money market funds, thereby collapsing our banking system. You say, well, why is that? Well, the money market funds in those days were mainly, vast majority, I don't know the exact, but I'm going to say over 90% of the money market funds were made up of bank paper. And when you go back in history and you look at our big banks, you'll see that somewhere between 20 and 40% of their funding was done through money market instruments. Now, what does that mean? That means they borrowed short, but they were investing long, okay? The thing that you're not supposed to do. And by the way, Timmy Geithner, I thought, did, an okay job during the crisis, but the biggest thing that he did was he stuck around for a couple years after the crisis. And if you go back and read through, he concentrated on one thing, and that's the money market funds. So in the end, the new rules were printed. Prime funds, which are money market funds made up of corporate, if your instruments that you were putting into the money market fund broke the dollar, they were down, then you had to break the dollar. The only ones that don't have to break the dollar are Treasury money market funds. And look at what's going on with the Treasury money market funds. They're the biggest, prime or not, okay? And in fact is the day that we went into COVID, by the way, and what happened, which no one talks about because we threw so much money into the market, was Goldman Sachs prime fund or corporate fund broke the buck. And Goldman couldn't cover the debts, all right, of their money market funds without driving themselves into bankruptcy. So what happened? We bailed them out, okay? So every market correction, there's some kind of liquidity event, negative liquidity event, before we have the market correction, okay? So you sit there and say, all right, what's the Fed afraid of today? Oh, geez, 2 weeks ago, the largest trade in the world, the yen carry trade, which is a liquidity trade for the investment world, broke down, okay? Now, this trade is huge. So think about what happened in the Great Financial Crisis. It was oil, which is basically the biggest trade, commodity trade, every day in the world. And yet the biggest liquidity trade is the yen carry trade, which, by the way, is probably the biggest trade in history, okay? Now, they're saying that we fixed it all in that 4 hours on that Friday. I'm not so sure of that. But even if they did, which I don't think they did, and their actions have proved it. Look at what the BOJ said the other day, that the global markets are totally unstable. And then you look at the Fed's action, it's almost like they're setting us up that they're going to reduce the interest rates, but it may be because they see that the liquidity of the market now is highly compromised. Do we know this? No, we don't. What we're doing is what I watch, and you can watch whatever you want. What I watch is there some kind of liquidity event? What money is invested in that liquidity event? And can that money invested in the liquidity event drive down the stock market? I don't know. What do you think? Like and follow and tell me if this could happen to us again. Thank you very much.